朋友们，这一期跟大家分享一个视频。视频里呢有4位汽车领域的专家，他们聚在一起探讨欧美的电动车品牌该如何战胜中国电动车。这4个人当中有一个戴眼镜的稍微年轻一点的嘉宾，他在视频中主要是回答另外3位的提问。他是美国咨询公司 Alex Partner 的全球汽车市场负责人、合伙人兼董事总经理。他的工作内容就是汽车和工业产品领域的并购战略和运营。所以从他的工作背景，我们可以看出，这个人的确在汽车领域经验丰富。他对中国这边的了解也非常深入，连996都知道，甚至还为996进行了一番辩护，特别的有意思。而另外几个嘉宾他们从中国采购过好几台中国电动车，进行过详细的测评。所以对于中国电动车的质量、性能、功能各方面都有一定程度的认知。他们的交谈重点已经不是单纯的评论中国电动车本身的好与不好、技术先不先进等等，他们思考的是欧美的电动汽车品牌，尤其是那些传统大厂，在面临中国几乎全方位完胜的基础上，如何找到活下去的空间。他们提出了一些意见和措施，但是我认为就这个视频中所呈现出来的各个嘉宾的意见想法，大概能看出他们对于中国电动车横扫欧美，已经是抱着板上钉钉、无力回天的态度。他们认为中国车占全球的占比，哪怕是1/3都算少的，就像当年以丰田汽车为代表的日系车横扫美国一样。他们年纪都很大，见证过当年日系车进军美国的全过程，所以在他们的眼里，今天被捧得高高在上的日本车，当年最开始的时候就是一坨垃圾。也因此他们对于今天中国车进入美国市场其实并不排斥，无非呢又是一个轮回罢了。重点是欧美的汽车制造商在这一次到底能不能顶得过这一波中国攻势。我们来看看相关的视频。
Are looking at the Chinese auto industry, and man, this thing's
We
a
are.
juggernaut. This thing's a steamroller.
Yeah.
And what you guys essentially came out and warned the legacy industry. I don't want to call it the Western because this includes Japan and South Korea too.
Absolutely.
But the legacies
And Europe.
better change or else.
Yeah, in a quantum way too. And we've talked last year about some of this ways to maybe separate and do other things. This year we tried to bring it up a level to talk about particularly product development, but about just getting out of the boiling pot.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it can feel good with, and there's some people are feeling very good about the lack of BEV takeoff and how this is all playing out and how much demand there is for ICE vehicles. But the competitive dynamics that are going on in China and BYD's ascension in that, not just them though, Li Auto, a few others are pretty impressive, are painting the picture of a new operating model that even if it's held out of the US, and even if it's held out of Europe, which is less likely with building factories there and such, someone else could replicate that, and it's a winning model. And it's tried and true in China, and now somewhat scary if we don't do more quantum changes to the fundamental approaches and how we're organized, not just going a little faster or being a little more innovative. Like, it's not whipping people harder or hiring smarter people. It's changing how we work. And without that, we could wake up in 5 years and be too late, because the compounding improvement and changes that are going on in the knife fight that is China will eventually spill over.
So you see the Chinese automakers having, what, 33% of the market of the global market by 2030?
Yes.
So they lead in EVs, they lead in technology, they lead in supply chain, they lead in cost. I'm struggling to see the opportunity for anyone else and feeling that 33% is low.
Well, you have protectionism, so it's still in play at that point. So in our 2030, we had a 1% market share in the US, like a 20-something percent in Mexico, as an example. But the bigger issue is it's not written yet. There's enough things to play that there's time to move and time to do things. The market in Europe and North America is not heavily BEV yet. We aren't really on what we call like a level 4 of SDVs with real-time immersive connections. These things are still being written, the autonomous side still being written, and even the battery electric side, the chemistries are moving fast. It's not like you're too late now, but let a few generations go and run just for cash, and instead of running for a decades-long winning strategy, and there may not be decades-longness out there.
So you guys found that they have a cost advantage as much as 35%, product development times twice as fast, as little as 20 months, higher vertical integration as much as 75%, 20 times over-the-air updates post-launch.
Yeah.
Okay, couldn't someone in a Western company simply say, hey, China's car companies are basically state-owned. That's direction from the top. It's government controlled. We're free market. That's just ridiculous. We're not going to do it.
Well, we're not free market, or else they'd be here right now. It's probably a thankful thing for many. But BYD, Li Auto, Geely, others are not the state-owned ones. Yes, they have support locally and otherwise. NIO, a lot of support. Others, some substantial support. But they aren't the FAW, SAIC traditionals, right? It's actually a new breed in China that are winning in this, and that are actually taking share from the traditional Chinese brands in China as well. It's just that the two of those combined are demolishing the Western auto brands in China. So it's you were saying that the up twos, and not all of them are up to quite that amount, but there's a competitive advantage to the way they're organized. And it's not just saying, I'm going to launch in 20 months. It's saying, I'm going to launch in 20 months and setting up the things required to do that, and to be able to do the OTAs afterwards, and being willing to do those, being willing to prioritize and focus on just what matters in the requirements to customers and to a competitive nature. And then a fundamental belief that if I don't launch this in 20 months, it's dead. So time is not a variable, because there's not an opportunity to compete with a 1-year-old vehicle launching in China. You'd be a technology past in the generation. Everyone looked at the Xiaomi SU7 and went, "Oh my God, let's go faster. Let's put more in." They looked at all these different vehicles. Each one that comes out reinforces the idea that to win in the NEV market in China, time can't be a variable. You must launch, and it can succeed or fail, but you're guaranteed to fail to take an extra year.
Mark, when I talk to people about this need for the legacies to change, and these advantages that the Chinese have, there's so much denial, and if it goes beyond denial, it's like, well, they get all access to these low-cost loans. The government is supporting them. What's your response to that?
So what? Compete. I don't know if there are aspects of that matter. And there's also brand legacies that matter a lot, and that have an advantage of some brands that mean a lot and have a lot of trust in luxury and quality and other areas that the Chinese don't sell on that. They sell on, features and this sort of thing. It's like there's not an Apple-based selling piece. It's more, NIO's trying to do a bit of that, but it's much more of a Samsung style cell phone sell of, look at this feature, look at this stuff that I can do. So there's an opportunity to leverage some of those things. It's not that there's only one way of doing it and only one set of competitive advantages. You could take a different approach, but to ignore 20 months, to ignore the totally reorganized product development without chassis, body, instead hardware and software, a CI/CD, like continuous development, continuous software development layer that's just has a hardware connection layer to it, but it's not coupled to the hardware. and is able to continually innovate along agile cycles, this exists. It's real, and it's better, and it's producing better vehicles. And it's vehicles you couldn't have done this 20 years ago, because the software, the electronics wasn't available. It's easier in the EVs, but it's happening in the Reeves as well, the extended range ones. And so I would say you still have to look at the advantages and what are people doing and what can I do or do better, with or without some state subsidies or other things going on. And even the cultures. The 996 culture is alive and well.
What do you mean 996?
9 to 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week is the sort of the shtick in China for these startups. We were talking to a Western company who's trying to hire a new team in China, and they were dismayed because a lot of the people they were interviewing were excited to go work for them because they wouldn't have to work so hard. And so there is other aspects there that are daunting when you say, okay, how do I set up my culture and my structure and my processes and be willing to clean sheet it enough to make something that fights this off and takes advantage of it. Because even if you and I are both making cars here and no one actually does come in, but I do those changes and you don't, I'm going to beat you. So I don't really even understand the focus of will they or won't they come. And it's not so much about a Chinese player like BYD coming as much as it is the quantum changes that are being shown to be better.
I wanted to ask about one aspect of the clean sheet, though. So organized labor is in ascent in this country. The UAW in particular just negotiated their most lucrative contract in decades. They just organized Volkswagen. So how do you overcome those labor costs? How do you get competitive on labor costs without somehow severing ties with the United Auto Workers, which doesn't seem likely in this country?
I don't think labor isn't a huge portion of the cost structure compared to, say, battery chemistry, for example. If it's $1 billion to launch a vehicle and I take an extra year, I've spent a couple $100 million extra. If I don't do virtualized testing, I've spent another couple $100 million there. So there's other big things that are there. And then the labor piece comes down to economics of the automation, cobots, what's the labor rate in Mexico, and taking an approach of, fortunately, coldly looking at what's the best outcome for the industrial apparatus that I want to put together. We talked a bunch last year about different ways of setting up a factory and these sort of things, and those are things you could do. They're a lot easier to do if you do a structural change like this. But those also reduce the number of heads needed, so it can be less, which a union can choose to say, I'm going to try to hold on to a number of jobs and create uneconomic waste, or I'm going to try to organize other things and make sure everyone has good rights and isn't taken advantage of, but be economic players in terms of how many jobs are actually needed and the humane retraining or severing of employees. So I don't think it's incompatible with a progressive UAW approach. Sorry, left my phone out there, but my watch still stuck me.
We had Merrick
Masters
in here. He's an industrial relations expert. And his observation, I totally agree with it, by the way, is it's not so much the wage rates, it's the lines of demarcation, it's the work rules, it's the inflexibility that the union brings to any kind of shop. That's the real issue.
It is the us versus them is a real issue. You've walked the Toyota and Honda floors with the jumpsuits and not really telling who's who other than who everyone pays attention to. There's a sense of everyone in it together in good factories. some union factories too. It's a little easier to be us versus them and two parties in a unionized one, and particularly one where jobs are shrinking. That's a difficult situation. Remember, unions came into play not because of, hey, we need this to do this thing. It was because of abuses of the automakers and others to protect. So if you believe your fundamental role is to protect, it can be limiting, and you can get to a local maximum pretty quickly instead of the global maximum of actually working together. So I think it depends, but I think the wage rate doesn't help. It makes automation in Mexico more attractive.
Does 996 also include the engineering staff that's involved in doing these things?
Yeah,
and so the thing that I wonder about is that, you know, this isn't an issue of just a trade union movement, whether it's here or other European countries, but I mean it's a whole cultural thing. I mean, whether you're in Germany or in England or France or the United States, if somebody told you you're working, you know, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, they'd be against it, whether, you know, this is at Starbucks or Walmart or General Motors.
It would be, unless, you know, you have, particularly, you know, China and the US, very aspirational culture that wants to succeed, that wants the hero entrepreneur and the hero business person, and, you know, aggrandizes that compared to a European that's maybe more doctor, lawyer, formerly priest, kind of aggrandized thing. And the you know, the capitalist is a mercantilist, you know, second tier person. Particularly, you know, Silicon Valley has, you know, a tremendous history of people working to the bone to accomplish fantastic things.
There's always been a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow,
There's a pot of gold
though.
at the end of the, but even in this town, I mean, you guys have all been through some launches that people put in heroic amounts of effort to get out the door and to do tremendous things. It's a vehicle I was when you started your chief engineer thing, I was thinking of a certain chief engineer that just retired that worked through something with his team, was fantastically devoted to launching that vehicle. And that mode sort of propagates itself and reinforces itself and then becomes success. When things are allowed to settle, it gets uncomfortable because somebody else isn't comfortable.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering if everything that we're talking about is how the legacy automakers can catch up to what China's already doing. I'm just wondering if there are any opportunities to leap ahead. You know, in the United States, the domestic automakers do pickup trucks better than anybody else, right?
Yeah.
Somebody always has their area of expertise that gives them an edge and keeps them alive.
Yeah.
So what is the edge that the legacy automakers would have over the Chinese?
I wouldn't say it's an edge. They have brand edge in many different ways. They have a fairly homogeneous market that has FMVSS type walls around it and other things that make it a somewhat unique market compared to others that allows them to grow to scale. Like in China, there's a few profitable, there's a ton massively unprofitable, right? Until you get to like 400,000 or 500,000 units, you have no prayer. So there is a lot of that going on there too, that make it more difficult than here. It's nice not to have 130 automakers competing with you in the United States. However, the bigger reaches are the broader out there. I'm talking about more nuts and bolts of what needs to be done now for the 5 years from now vehicles and approach. The 20 years out thing, you get into autonomous pods that are built for 3 years of life and then disposable. You get into multimodal and taking out train and plane and autonomous on highway in between things. All the fun moonshotty things to think about, and then expanding the pool of who's mobile into goods and people to make sure deadheading isn't as much there, handicap, old, young, autonomous unlocks a lot of those things, which is the fun iPhone moment to think about in the auto industry. And the U.S. is very well poised to have a great shot at that.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to what you've been talking about, though, of how the legacies essentially need to reinvent themselves or restructure themselves. Yeah. If you were a CEO looking at a legacy company, where would you start? I mean, here are companies, in most cases that we're talking about, been around 100 years. They have 100 years of policies and procedures and ways of doing things. How do you start even the process of change, and what changes do you make?
Well, you don't do it by consensus, probably. You do it with a plan, and you do it recognizing that you want those vehicles that are out there in the market now to continue to be producing cash, but you need to make fundamental changes going forward. So the sunk cost of, oh, but I validated this and I have this platform and I'd like to reuse this, those pieces have to be killed, and it has to go into a step change of, okay, I'm going to totally revamp my product development into hardware and software. And these are going to be completely separate types of organizations, the software being continuous, the hardware being launch and leave type things. I'm going to set my manufacturing in a different way to do more vertical integration, and to think of a supply chain in a completely different way as a network of things versus a vertical supply chain that I'm trying to get the right cost. I'm trying to dual source and trying to have economic leverage rather than sort of abusive leverage over my supply chain. And I'm going to build in things that allow me to be flexible with volumes and scale, and build units of scale and capacity, rather than trying to go for the big thing that looks great on a spreadsheet. But if it's off 20% up or down, it's a disaster of industrial economics. I would figure out how to revamp my branding to go after. It's a lot easier on an NEV to say, on a REV or a battery electric vehicle, really to start with a different brand, or a brand that isn't also trying to sell an old style vehicle. And kind of separating the company into two approaches. There's a whole bunch of stuff that has to change for the future ones. And even then, if I'm killing a evolutionary vehicle that's going to launch in 2 years for something that's going to launch in 3 that's ground up, so be it. But those kinds of things I would change right away. And it would be doing it in a way that's got a plan in place to be able to execute, not with a hope that it produces something good. There's a bit too much of this sort of, well, if I do agile scrums, that'll just work itself out. It has to be in concert with the architecture. It has to be in concert with the way you're going to do the manufacturing, and the way you're going to do the OTAs after, the way you're going to even interact with the customer in the vehicle, and the way you're going to get revenues then to match more recurring revenues that match my recurring costs of those services I'm providing, and lesser costs, not just added revenue, lesser costs in the hardware side.
But I mean, what becomes the moment when someone decides they need to do this? I mean, it strikes me that you guys discovered that when you surveyed in China, that there was basically price parity with an EV and an ICE vehicle, that there was a good charging network, and that there was a benefit in terms of licensing. Okay, so advantage, advantage, advantage. Here and in Western Europe, you guys discovered it's a 35 to 55% price penalty to get an EV. So what are we seeing in Europe, and what are we seeing here? Oh, a greater interest in hybrids and plug-in hybrids, right?
Yeah.
So if someone is saying, gee, we were all in on EVs, but now we want to be able to provide hybrids and plug-ins because this is what the market wants.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you reconcile these two things? Because it seems to me that you would immediately default to the legacy approach in order to provide those hybrids and plugins.
That's where I think it likely makes sense to somewhat separate companies, and more so than people have done to date, which is a bit more customer.
When you say separate companies, you mean you need an internal startup along with the legacy ops?
Probably as not more than that, an actual separation of parts of the company into two separate companies.
So not Saturn and the rest of General Motors.
No, spin-off.
And not the Skunk Works or pilot things, or not the, It's good to pilot things and those sorts of things to see if an approach works, given the freedom of it. But to then do it at an industrial scale, it takes
a new company.
And really a carved out piece that operates with the freedom to change the way it's operating.
Interesting what you're saying, because we're seeing GM and Ford take two different approaches. Ford doing the Skunk Works, maybe going to grow a new company. GM saying, no, we're keeping it integrated.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really tough to keep it integrated. Both of them are still fairly integrated.
Yes. Yes. Too much so.
Yeah, they're fairly integrated, and I think that holds them back considerably. There's no real difference in how a supplier sells to Ford an EV part versus an ICE part, for example. The relationship isn't much different. The approach to validating and going through a vehicle isn't terribly different, and it needs to be. And the way requirements are set, the way the business case is set, and decisions get made, that needs to be different, and that's hard to do in an evolutionary way. Maybe it's not impossible. We'll see. It would seem to be a lot easier to burn a bridge than be tempted to go back across the bridge each day.